Thank you so much to everybody in the room and for those on the live stream for joining us this evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to In Defense of Democracy. As we begin, I'd like to provide a land acknowledgement for the place we call Toronto or Takaranto. For our live stream viewers, I encourage you to personally acknowledge the territory and lands that you are joining us from. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And this is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I'm grateful for this acknowledgement because it reminds me that an understanding of Indigenous laws, systems of governance, and ways of knowing are foundational to and alive in what we now recognize as democracy in Canada. I'd like to take a moment now to thank our In Defense of Democracy sponsors. Our reception sponsor this evening is TELUS, so please be sure to stick around for that. And we also want to recognize Bennett Jones, the Donner Canadian Foundation, Toronto Metropolitan University's Faculty of Arts, and our thanks to CBC Radio's Ideas for being our media sponsor. Tonight, the Samara Centre is marking 15 years of dedication to realizing a resilient democracy with responsive institutions and an engaged public. We have made progress on this front through rigorous research, novel collaborations, and also by sharing stories. In particular, stories about what it's really like to work in the political arena. The Samara Centre's first initiative was led by our co-founders, our first executive director, Alison Lote, and our board chair, Michael McMillan. Their aim was to draw on the lived experience of former members of Parliament to get a critical look at the practice of politics in Canada. They worked with a team to conduct exit interviews with 80 former MPs, because when you're not in the job anymore, you can speak very frankly. And their findings and insights were shared in the 2014 bestseller, Tragedy in the Commons. What Alison and Michael found about leadership, power dynamics, and public sentiment still rings true. Now more than ever, across all orders of government, Canada is experiencing a political drought. In Ontario, dozens of municipal candidates in recent local elections ran unopposed. It was the same in Manitoba, where 64 heads of council were acclaimed. Over the past few months, local elections across the country have also resulted in record lows for voter turnout, largely around 30 to 40%, which is a failing grade. So, is it the absence of competitive races and compelling candidates that's holding the electorate back? Or is it a lack of public engagement that's keeping would-be candidates at home? It's debatable. What's beyond dispute is that anyone running for office will almost certainly be subjected to online abuse, disinformation, and sometimes outright threats against themselves and their families. Of course, all this pushes the electorate away instead of drawing us in. The question then isn't why qualified, reasonable people are choosing not to run. It's why any qualified, reasonable person would willingly subject themselves to this treatment. Similarly, the question isn't why didn't you vote, complete with finger wagging and shaming, but rather what would help voters feel that the electoral process can meet their needs. Our team has been giving a lot of thought to how we can move beyond the simplistic directives of you should vote or you should run. Securing a vibrant culture of civic engagement in Canada is not just about restoring civility and safety to our democracy, but restoring humanity to the political conversation. And we can do that with shared moments like we're having this evening, and also by sharing stories that give us a civic connection. Over the past few months, we've been building on Tragedy in the Commons and the second book based on the exit interview study, Real House Lives, which was published in 2020. And this time around, we're looking at those who left the House of Commons between 2015 and 2021. These conversations have been candid, emotional, and powerful. One of the former MPs we've spoken to is Robert Falcon Ouellette, who represented the riding of Winnipeg Centre. He told us about being the first MP to deliver a speech in Cree in the House, and how he worked with colleagues from different parties to push through barriers, bureaucratic, emotional, otherwise, to get translation in place for it. Here's a quote from him. There's not a lot of MPs using the interpretive services and Indigenous languages all the time in the House, but now it's there and it can be used. And the importance for Indigenous people is it tells them that this institution is also theirs. It is inclusive of them. This is not an institution which is only for the colonizers, the settlers. This is actually an institution which speaks to each and every one of us. And we all have a place in that institution. That place, it's the people's place, the House of Commons of the people. We're very grateful for Robert's words because they illuminate that meaningful inclusion can amplify civic connection. In approaching this third iteration of the MP exit interview study, we wanted a new way to share these human voices. And in the spirit of sharing, I'm so thrilled to announce our partnership with Media Girlfriends, an award-winning podcast production company founded by the incredibly talented Nanaba Duncan, Garvia Bailey, and Hannah Sung. Together, the Samara Centre and Media Girlfriends are creating a new podcast based on our recent interviews with former MPs, and it will launch in early 2023. You'll hear the voices of former MPs breaking it all down, demystifying life in federal politics and sharing their thoughts about attracting and retaining the best and the brightest as political leaders. You can scan the QR code on this card to subscribe to our newsletter and stay up to date on release details. And we're ever so grateful for support from Heritage Canada and Rosamond Ivy for this exciting project. I'd like to leave you with one brief final thought. Current events are underscoring the fragility of liberal democracy around the world, bringing a shared experience of fear and grief. But we should remember that struggle is inherent to democracy, and with struggle can come evolution. Together, we have an opportunity to draw on our collective democratic imagination to make the most of this period of change. And tonight, we couldn't be in better hands for how to get moving on that front. It's time for the main event. I'm going to turn things over now to the second of 3 brown Albertans that you're going to hear from this evening. I'm really delighted to welcome our board member and host of the Razor Sharp Strategist podcast, Zane Belge.